it's less so. It seems to me most of those areas of practice and expertise are going to remain relevant for the foreseeable future, but there are emerging areas of activity, digital history. I didn't know about IT history, but that sounds exciting. I mean, where do you see sort of emerging opportunities in the near term that programs ought to be attuned to, and students as well?
Go ahead.
Well, I think a big opportunity is to not see the academic world divided into, or not see the historical world divided into academic history and public history, but to realize that there's a lot of overlap, and there's more and more overlap, and that's a great thing. And there's this whole other area that's huge, and it's, I guess I'm sort of drawing, I think of it as a spectrum, but it's really just this amorphous mass, constantly shifting. But there's this whole other set of areas that include, I guess, popular history, but also when you're talking about careers, academic, public, but thinking about all the stuff that the AHA and OAH and other organizations are now calling versatile, or the malleable PhD, the versatile PhD, or MA. People used to call it alternate careers. I guess that's come back as ALTAC. There's a website and a group for ALTAC. But careers where you're doing anything. You're in business, you're an investment banker, you're starting your own IT company, but you have had some degree in history or degrees in history, and you're bringing some of those historical thinking skills, that broad flexibility of mind, able to solve problems, you're bringing that to whatever that job is. And I had right before coming here, I had a very long conversation with Daryl Meadows about this. I don't mean to just steal from that conversation, but there are so many opportunities here to move history out of academic or the public history slot. And I guess that's kind of what I meant earlier about public history being so successful as a subfield within the academy, and I guess that gets to your question of so many history departments embracing public history, and they stop thinking about, well, what about all those people who have history degrees, BAs, MAs, and PhDs who are working as lawyers or working for an NGO or starting a restaurant or becoming a politician. We want those people, we need those people, and I've always thought of public history as including that. I've always had a very kind of broad vision, I think. I've kept it quiet to myself. But I think that's the new frontier, and I think public history programs that are training MAs in particular with that kind of like, well, I could go work at a historical society or in a museum, or I could take those same skills and work at some other kind of nonprofit or something else, work at a bank or a business. I think that's going to be interesting. And I guess another way to characterize that is to, we always talk about public historians being entrepreneurial, having to be entrepreneurial. I think that's, like, if they're really entrepreneurs, they will find a place for themselves, and we will find places for ourselves.
I think one of the ways in which public history is going to have to grow is globally. I think the recession, which hit not only the United States but other nations as well, has slowed this down a little bit. But there's a whole world out there of heritage makers who have very little connection to those of us who do public history in the United States, and vice versa. And this hit home. The National Council on Public History met in Ottawa, and I sat there listening to wonderful presenters talk about their work, Canadians talking about their work in Canadian sites, and Americans talking about their work in American sites. If you think about the way public history training has been set up, it's largely local programs that do work in local settings. The students do their internship, the majority of students do their internship somewhere around the state, locally, in many cases. Very few go out and do a federal internship unless they're fortunate enough to be at George Washington University. But I do think that, you know, at some point we have to start imagining how we fit into a larger global history, which is somewhat of the trend on the history side, right? This world history discipline that has emerged. And public historians haven't even really begun to engage that in meaningful ways. And so I do think, yeah, and I think of this because I work at a school that has one of the top Parks, Rec, and Tourism management programs. And I've had many conversations with the people over there about the connections with heritage tourism, which they teach. And they send out teams to work across the country, and they've never once asked a historian to join them on a team to work on heritage. And they never even thought of that. So, you know, there's a lot of disconnect between the disciplines. I looked on the website for our School of Design, and they can train you in the School of Design to be a historian, a museum curator. You know, they claim they can do all of this. So even other disciplines are tapping into the argument that they can train the types of jobs that public history has traditionally done. And so across academic disciplines, but also beyond the boundaries of the United States, I do think there's a lot of work for us to do in creating a broader sense of what public history means beyond our local, state, or even national boundaries.
And I think one of the limitations of the public history field for the last 30 years is that it has been almost, in the United States, it has been almost 100% Americanist, people doing U.S. history, and it's because, it's either because it happens at the federal level or it happens at the state and local level. There are more public historians now coming along who do other kinds of history, and that helps open up those opportunities with institutions and individuals around the world. At the AASLH, American Association for State and Local History meeting that I was just at last week, they partnered with the International Sites of Conscience, which is I don't know if you've all heard of it, but it's a consortium of 15 or 20, maybe 30, I don't know, sites around the world that have to do with crises of conscience or you know, Holocaust sites or apartheid sites in South Africa, and there are more and more historical institutions and sites in the United States, for example, that I would consider sort of state or local, that are seeing themselves in that international context of being a sites of conscience, and so that was a nice bring together two worlds there. And you're right, I think more and more of that will happen as the internet makes it easy for those kinds of introductions and collaborations and sharing of information.
Well, I'm delighted to hear you bring up this point of transnationalism. I had a question prepared. I was trying to decide quickly if you've engaged it thickly enough. I think I'm going to throw it back to you for just a second. Are there other ways you think that the field can continue moving in this? I think you're right to identify that there's a tension between the way that we have done work is locally, and it makes a lot of sense to do local work, but are there other ways that we can continue extending local work to beyond the national level even?
I think so. I mean, it's easy to say from where I sit. I don't actually have to do it, but I have heard people talking about the sort of the crises of the, you know, do we need another house museum? You know, there are a lot of small museums and institutions that were started because there was a nice historical property there or some kind of collection or someone left some money, and in good economic times those all can have their donors and visitors, but as things get more competitive and difficult, it's hard to find the visitors and financial support for all that, and even more successful larger state and local institutions maybe have those challenges. But I could see, again, it's easy for me to say because I'm not, if I were a curator at a small or a smaller institution like that, state or local, I might try and put my institution or the history I was trying to tell of that state or local region into an international context. Maybe not all the time, but it would make a really interesting exhibit. Anyway, I think there are ways to do that, and what will make it easier is as more history departments, people in history departments who are not Americanists come around to the idea of public history and start collaborations with state and local institutions to provide that kind of expertise.
I don't know if I could add it more. If I think of something, I'll jump in later.
Thank you for.
It does seem to me, I mean, just to pick up on your answer, it seems to me that one thing that public historians have done very well at traditionally is breaking out of provinciality, right? Because of the nature of very, very locally focused work, local collections, local sites, you know, relating seemingly small histories to bigger frames has been a mainstay of the field for a long time. And so there's a shift that needs to happen to think globally, transnationally, but that may not be as inaccessible as it might seem.
And I would think it's getting easier and easier to do as more documents from around the world and are ending up in digital collections where you can work in a really intense kind of way with very good digital reproductions of, and not just documents, but you know, all kinds of data sets and images and even I guess images of artifacts. You could put together. I don't know, it's becoming easier to put your work and your institution's work into an national context, I think.
And connected discourses that are part of that discussion.
Yeah, but I think there's a real academic challenge here then for those of us who run programs, right? Is it's not enough to train our students in American history. We should now be training our students in world history so they get the notion of how to develop world themes. And we'll take questions in a moment.
I believe you.
Say amen.
Amen.
I mean, if that's what we're going to do, right, we're going to have to train students beyond the American narrative. And that's a challenge because almost everybody who does world history is not Americanist, right? And they're not necessarily the people who populate public history faculty. So it's really going to require a bit of a shift in the type of faculty who are training public historians.
Well, I'm sure we're up to doing that here in Louisville. So with that thought in mind, I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions from people who are current students, recent graduates who are now working in the field, and everybody who's joined us for the evening, including a lot of people from local institutions that we've, I think, established good partnerships with and want to continue to cultivate. So who would like to lead off with a question? Amber?
I'm Amber Duke. I'm a graduate of this program. My question is about how public historians are faring within the academy. So you guys were talking earlier about the importance of public historians being connected to the community. But of course, in an academic environment, though academic institutions are talking so much about civic engagement and community work, that hasn't necessarily translated to something that's counted in annual work plans and these sorts of things that professors have to be working towards. So I'm just kind of wondering about how that tension is playing out.
As the introductions were made, it was mentioned that John was part of this report on promotion and tenure standards and making recommendations. And I'm one of those people who then took that report to my department and said, you know, let's think of other ways, other types of scholarship that will go towards tenure and promotion that isn't necessarily a book or a journal article. And my department went, yes, yes, we like this, we like this. And then, amazingly, you know, the first time this came up as a real practical issue, they retracted, you know, because what they said was, you know, what, a digital, you know, a website, you want us to consider that towards scholarship, you know, and what they didn't get was we weren't talking about just changes in the content, but also changes in delivery and different approaches to audience, and they just didn't grasp that. So as much as, you know, I applaud that idea, it's really hard to implement in programs, and I'm in a program where about a third of the faculty are now engaged in the public history program.